Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I noticed we have a buzzword bingo between the two rooms. I won't be talking about quantum computers or anything like that, but hopefully something interesting. So my name is Staffan Truvé. I come from a company called Recorded Future. So we do threat intelligence. It's the only thing. Oh, thank you. Oh, there you go. Much better. Anyway, so I come from a company called Recorded Future. We do threat intelligence. It's the only thing we do. We've been around for about 9 years. We probably have one of the longest histories in our system of cyber threat intelligence. About 200 people. We are based in Boston, US, but we actually do all our R&D in Gothenburg, in Sweden, where I'm staying. So our idea when we started thinking about this was that, you know, over the last decade or so, all of us have become one big sensor. We're feeding the machines now with all kinds of information by what we're writing, blogging, tweeting, and so on. And we started thinking that we should be able to use this information for something more than just putting it into search engines. So our goal, our ambition is really to use everything that is published on the web to do analytics of different kinds. And you can, of course, use this for tons of different things, but our big focus is to use this for threat intelligence. So if you look at the state of the art in security, I think this picture still represents pretty well what we're doing. You know, so you take your valuable assets, you build a big wall around it, and then you focus on, you know, going around checking, are there any holes in the wall, and maybe are there any bad guys on the inside of the wall trying to do things. That's sort of what we tend to do. And we think that, you know, and of course you must do that. That's, of course, necessary. But we think the important complementary piece is really to look at the outside of the wall as well and see what's happening, you know. So to continue this physical analogy, you know, are there people out there on the outside who have keys to my doors? Maybe I should be worried about that. Maybe there are guys out there asking for the keys, you know, or asking how to get in different ways. We see that every day, people asking for advice about how to get into some company's systems and so on. Maybe there's someone on the outside who's selling my stuff, you know, a sign that someone has done something. Or maybe there are blueprints out there, you know, the secret passage under the wall, which some clever guy put in at some point, and now someone is releasing the blueprints for that. But also more general things like, are people out there talking about new ways to attack places like this? Or maybe even if there are places like my place which have been attacked recently, you know. So, for example, if you're let's say a Swiss bank, and there's been a history the last few days of Swiss banks being attacked, and you have not seen that you're under attack, either you have been extremely lucky, or you just haven't noticed that yet, that you've been attacked, right? So we think that you really have to be on the outside, looking in as well. And we do this with all kinds of different sources, you know. So we come from the open source side, harvesting everything from big media to blogs to social media down to hacker forums and so on. And then we complement that with less open places, you know, what people like to call dark web, terrible name, but all kinds of Tor onion sites and these kind of things where people tend to stick interesting information. We also do our own threat research, and we also complement that with technical sources like, for example, domain registration information, DNS traffic information, and so on. So just to give some very simple example of what we mean with threat intelligence, you know. So of course, if you run a big company, you should be checking whether your credentials are popping up in, say, paste sites, for example. You know, simple example, you just go in and look for bt.com and hashes on paste sites or forums and so on. And if you see these things, of course, these are typically not things which have been leaked from your big corporate systems. I would say that in 99% of the cases, these are cases when people have been using their company email to register for, you know, a golf tournament or something like that. And then, of course, that system got hacked. But these credentials are still bad. First of all, because people are, of course, sloppy and reuse their passwords in different systems. But also because these other sites might help someone spoof someone's identity, and by doing that, they could pose a risk. You know, that's a great way to start a phishing attack, for example. Similarly, if you notice that someone is spending all day registering typo squatting domains which look similar to yours, I love this one, the Brutish Telecom on the bottom side here. If this is happening, you know, and like we saw last week in Sweden, for example, we had all the major banks had tons of of various typo-squatting domains registered for them. So clearly a sign that someone is preparing to do something bad. So this is looking directly at data, but as I mentioned, you really want to go sort of aggregate this and do some kind of analytics. So here's a higher level example, again. So what we're doing here, we're showing a timeline of ransomware attacks against the banking industry. So this is using a lot of our capabilities. First of all, the fact that we do natural language processing to analyze the text, to classify text as talking about a cyber attack. We're identifying the entities, the banks in this case. And we also have a classification of different kinds of malware. So this allows us to do this kind of high-level analysis very easily. Similarly, you can use our system to do dashboards like this. So here's an example of, let's say, over 60 days, what are the most important attacks being talked about? What are the attackers in case they're identified? Who are the targets? What tools are they using? All the way down to, which IP addresses are included in this. And we also aggregate information around entities, like if you have a CVE, what's everything the internet knows about that CVE? So we aggregate that into one single frame for you. So in a way, you can say that much of what I showed you here is really, trying to describe what has happened. I said I wanted to be proactive, but, one part of that is understanding, of course, what has happened. In this picture, I think the two important parts here is that with all the data we get, we can both describe what actually has happened, and as I'll come to in a little while, we think we can also predict some things that will happen in the future. But let's start a bit with the descriptive part, because that's really a necessary precursor to doing the predictive side. So our idea in general then is to aggregate massive amounts of data from wherever we can. And we think in the end that machines are great at some tasks, but in the end you also need to complement that by human systems. So that's why we like to use these Ascent Tower as an analogy. So that comes from computer chess. So in chess, the Ascent Tower is when you take a reasonably good chess program and you have it work together with a decent human chess player. And I would say at least up till last fall, when DeepMind did some interesting stuff, I would say that the best chess player in the world has been this combination, a good combination, well-functioning between man and machine. So essentially, we want to do the same thing for threat analysts, to build Ascent Tower threat analysts, where we build the best possible tools so that the human analysts can focus on what they're really good at. And in essence, so that amounts to a large extent to taking all this unstructured information which is out there, analyzing and structuring and organizing it, presenting it in different ways so that the human analyst can very quickly decide what to focus on and dive deeper into that. So this is what we call our little threat intelligence machine. So we take all this data, we analyze it, we present it in two ways. One is the UI, which is examples of here, and the other one is an API, so that not only can the humans use this data, but you can also plug it into your SIM systems or your IDS or whatever, so you can automate things. For example, you saw we had risk scores on IP addresses. Of course, what you can do is if risk score is high enough, you could automatically block those IPs in your system. Similarly to how you use other kinds of threat lists. So we really want to use AI and machine learning in two different ways. The first one is to describe, and that sort of can be broken down into two parts. One is to organize the data. So we're using natural language processing to go from unstructured open text to a structured representation, which is also language independent, because what we're doing is we're saying that this sentence talks about, say, a cyber attack, and we find the different attributes or the different roles in that cyber attack event. And that, of course, is a language-independent representation. So whether things are spoken in Chinese or Russian, we can translate them into this uniform representation. So this allows you to do quantitative analysis over different languages. Also allows you to do interesting trend analysis. So if one attack vector starts being talked about in Chinese and then it sort of migrates over to Russian and then it starts being talked about in German, maybe you should be more concerned about it because it's being discussed closer to home. So these are the things you can do. And the second part there is ontologies, to have structured representation about relationships, categorizing things. We use that in our analysis, but we also use that in search. So to take a physical world example, you can go into our system and search for, say, protests in Switzerland. And if you do that, even if there is a text or a tweet somewhere saying that, angry people are throwing rocks in the streets of Geneva today, we'll still be finding that because the system abstracts away from the concrete location. So we have a hierarchy, so our system knows that Geneva is part of Switzerland. So if you search for Switzerland, you'll find everything talking about any location here. And similarly, the event extraction abstracts away from the exact wording. So, we've trained it on tons of different ways that people talk about protests. So you don't have to do, as many people do, sit and try to figure out how should I search for this, which word might be used. We've sort of taken care of those things for you. So then when you have this structured representation, then you can, of course, do, I would say, mostly traditional statistics. So you can do anomaly detection, you can find patterns and trends and so on. We'll come back to how that is one part of actually doing the predictive part. But the other part then is to actually predict future things. And there are, you could say, two basic ways of doing that. One is to do what we like to call temporal analysis. So we're doing, again, natural language processing to understand what calendar time people are talking about. If people say that next week on Monday morning I will be attacking this server, it's very great. You actually have an idea about that. You might think, well, people won't be so stupid. But on the other hand, some people who use the web to coordinate, like most hacktivists, actually do talk about future events just like this. So it's actually one way of being prepared for what's coming. But the real challenge is, of course, to do real prediction based on historic data. I think when we're talking about this trade-off between what humans and machine learning can do, it's important sometimes to think about that there are two different kinds of tasks we're trying to attack with machine learning. One is where we're essentially doing things which are simple or intuitive for humans, like reading or seeing things in images, driving cars, things which we normally don't think of very intelligent behavior. It's things that we just do. Like you can read this text and understand that, okay, so there's some connection between DDoS attacks and memcached, for example. But of course, the reason we want to do this with machine learning is that we have such huge volumes. So we just want to automate things to be able to scale this up at the scale where we want to analyze things. And then you have the other kinds of problems which are hard or probably even impossible for humans. So in this, the right-hand example here is a network connectivity graph about different IP addresses who've been engaged in communication, which we think are related to rat controllers. So this kind of problem is very hard for humans to attack, both because it's a huge volume of data, but also it's high dimensionality. There are too many factors to think about. And here it's fortunate that for these cases, the algorithms actually scale up much better than our human brains do. So of course one reason you need to distinguish between these two is for the left-hand case, it's very easy to use supervised machine learning because we can actually have humans provide the training data. We can bring in 100 people in a room and let them spend a few days sitting there and annotating text, as a basis for machine learning. On the right-hand side, we cannot do that since humans really don't know how to do it. On the other hand, maybe there's other kinds of training data we can use. And this is what we'll come back to in a little while here. So again, just to give you an idea about scale here. So this is our pipeline. So today we collect something typically between 20 and 30 million documents per day. And a document in our system is essentially anything from a small tweet up to a big fat PDF report. So huge variety in size. I like to think of, it's always hard. Our marketing people like to talk about the number of sources, which I think is a terrible way of quantifying things. But what my favorite unit of information is what we call a reference, which is one mentioning of one event in one source. So if one of you tweets something about, say, attending a meeting in Geneva, that's going to be one reference in our system. And typically today we get somewhere between 30 to 40 million references per day, or about 1 billion references per month. So a fair amount of data. And then we do our natural language analysis. So we do that in 9 languages today. So English, French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Chinese, traditional and simplified, Farsi, and we just added Portuguese and German as well. So this is sort of deeper semantic analysis that we do in the original language. Every half year or so, we try to use Google Translate into English and then do the analysis there. But it turns out you still lose too much of the finer details. So we still do this analysis in the original language. And then, of course, we detect things which are not language dependent, like hashes and IP addresses and those kinds of things we detect across all languages. And then we do our what we call signal analysis on this. So, for example, for every IP address we know in our system, all the events and entities have, and all the queries which have been defined by our users, we continuously track what kind of volume we see around it. So this is to be able to do alerting saying that now there's a certain uprise in mentions about cyber attacks against certain bank, for example, so that we can alert on that. And as I said, we've been doing this for 9 years now, so we have a pretty nice historic track record. And of course, for many cases, you're most interested in what's happening right now. But it turns out that we'll see that, first of all, in some cases, when you want to do forensics, it's quite important to have some history, because you can go back and look at typical attack patterns and so on, which actually could help you do attribution to understand who has been doing an attack. And also, of course, this data is invaluable when it comes to actually doing machine learning. But the first part, before we can dive into doing that machine learning part of the predictions, just a quick word on how we structure it. So we have a big pipeline, which goes from unstructured text to this structured representation. First simple task, which people sometimes don't think about, is just to get the important text out of a single web page, to understand automatically which is the relevant text, what is an advertisement I should be throwing away, what are the sidelines and the boilerplates at the bottom, and so on. Actually, much more complicated than one might think when starting out. And then we do all kinds of classifications. Is this code or text or a log? What language is it in? What topic? Is this business text, or is it a more technical text, or is it sports? One thing we do is we try to throw out all sports from our analysis, because especially when we're dealing with physical attacks, sport language, they love to use metaphors, so they crushed the other team, they killed the competition, and so on. So you get a ton of false positives if you're not sort of aware that this is a sport text. We should look at it in a different way. You still want to analyze it, because of course there are, as we saw, cyber attacks related to the Olympics, and we want to find those kinds of things. But we really don't care about who won the game. It's not our business. And as you can see here, we use a mixture of machine learning and rule-based system here. And the reason for that is that, first of all, of course, to be able to do something which is sort of pure algorithmic or rule-based, you need to have a problem which humans are good at formalizing the logic for. One good example is the temporal analysis, where we take the text and we take the publication date, and we use that to derive what the actual calendar time is. So if someone publishes something this morning and say, I plan to travel to Paris on Sunday, the system understands that this will be the coming Sunday. If it says last Sunday, it will be the last one before. So there, humans are pretty good at describing the logic of it. So therefore, we can build rules. But for other cases, like let's take the simple example of deciding if a piece of text is code or prose, normal text. It's not even obvious for us, I think. How do you express that simply? On the other hand, if you look at a sample piece of text, it's always obvious for us, if is this code or prose. So in that case, it's actually easier to use machine learning, where we can just provide training examples. And the other factor which we take into account when we decide which method to choose is also explainability. So in some cases here, the end users don't really care about how or why we classified something. They just want the end result to be good. But for example, on the bottom line, when we do risk scoring of IP addresses, for example, to decide how malicious is this IP, in that case, people want to have an explanation. They just don't want to hear that this one got a score 80 and this got 25. They want an explanation. And machine learning-based systems are still notoriously bad at providing explanations. It's a very active research field right now, what people call explainable AI, to be able to take machine learning model and actually generate explanations. But we think that's still on the research side. So in this case, we've found out that using a rule-based system is better, just because we can actually use the rules to provide human understandable descriptions of why we came to a certain conclusion. So what does this whole pipeline do then? Well, essentially what it does is it takes something like the tweets up on the upper side here, KKK, anonymous hacks KKK websites, and it turns it into the structured representation here, where we have a frame, as we call it, for the event, the cyber attack. And in this case, we found out some of the attributes. We found the attacker, which was anonymous. We found the organization, the target here, which was Ku Klux Klan. And the system has a lot of mechanisms for doing synonyms. So it knows that KKK is a synonym for Ku Klux Klan, for example. And it also found the operation here of KKK in this case. So as you can see, we can do the same thing. I could have taken a Chinese or an Arabic text talking about the same thing, and this structured representation would have been the same. So we've become language independent by going over to this form. So apart from this structure, then we have what we call our ontologies or taxonomies. So what we keep track of is, for example, for a certain malware, what are the attack vectors it's using? What category is it? Is say a mobile or an iPhone malware or something else? We keep track of technical things like the signatures, the hashes associated with it. If it's dependent on a certain CV, for example, we keep track of that, all the vulnerabilities associated with it, and so on. And this is also structured information, which is very useful when you're analyzing things, of course. Since, for example, if you see one signature in an attacked system, you can use the ontology, go back, and you can see, okay, so first of all, which malware is associated with this signature? Second, what are the organizations which are known to use this malware? And then you can go down again in the hierarchy and see, okay, so what other malware are these guys using, and what signatures should I be checking in my system to see if they're using this as well? So very handy for someone doing investigations. I think I talked about that already. So that's sort of the first half here. So now we've gone from unstructured text to a structured data representation. And then we can start doing the fun thing to see if we can actually use this to start predicting new things as well. So in general, predictions, my favorite analogy here is weather forecasts. For many reasons. First of all, because weather forecasts have actually, even if you joke about them, they have actually become much better over the last 20 years. And it's really a combination of three different things which has made them better. I would say, it's still the fact that the most important factor is better sensors. So we have more satellites, they are more fine-grained, they give you better sensor data, better information which you can base your predictions on. Then, of course, the Moore's law is always doing its job, so we can do more advanced calculations in shorter time. And the third part, which, is really the smaller part here, is the advancement in algorithms. We'll come back to this a bit later. But I think, these three things combined is what allows us to do better predictions of weather. And our whole idea here, of course, is that in a similar way, by using all the information out there on the web, using our system as a sensor, you can actually, with some clever algorithms, do some predictions in our domain as well. So, and predictions can be done in many different ways, So we actually have a whole battery of different ways of doing predictions, explicit ones. I'll come to some example patterns, and then sort of the machine learning based is just the final one. But explicit predictions, as I already mentioned, sometimes people are very nice, and this is a good example here. Someone is saying that the resistance is coming to Ferguson April 23rd. Well, maybe if you're a police officer in Ferguson, you should not be on vacation, or maybe you should be on vacation that day. I don't know. And you might think that this is only something people do for physical protests, for example, but one of my favorite examples is this, So this is some Pakistani hackers, which published very nicely on July 17. They said that on August 14, we'll be doing an attack on Indian government servers. So that's a nice heads-up warning for the guys in India that they should be prepared for something happening. So this, of course, is just one individual tweet about something. So the first step is to go from an individual mention to actually do some crowdsourcing, to just, see what are the trends here. So are there lots of people who start to talk about something, whether it's a physical protest or a cyber attack? How many people are the followers? Especially if people are doing sort of old-fashioned manual DDoSing and things like that. Clearly the number of followers of a movement like this is an interesting indicator. So that's the first way. The second way is to look at patterns. Favorite one of mine is anniversaries. So this is showing for 2011, 12, 13, 16, 17, and 2018 protests in Egypt. So, way back when they had the Arabic Spring thing, the big event there was on January 25. And every year since then, there have been big protests in Egypt. So as I'm sitting here today, I can already tell you that on January 25, 2019, there will be protests. It's probably not the best week to go to Cairo on vacation, actually. And so in some cases and in some cultures, I would say, these kinds of anniversaries are quite important. So again, they are an indicator of things happening. We have a cyber example here as well. So on April 7, many hackers from the Arabic world like to do attacks on Israel, because that's Holocaust Remembrance Day, so they think it's a good day to attack Israeli servers. Same thing there, pattern comes back, it's been going down over time a bit, but it's still sort of one of the days when the Israeli cybersecurity guys are on sort of extra alert, like that. So when we started thinking about what we could predict using our system, we actually started in this physical domain, so we said that it would be interesting if we could predict things like this, I guess it's Tahrir Square in Cairo, if we could predict that there will be an sort of abnormal number of angry people out in the streets next day. The inspiration for this was actually going back to what happened in Libya in 2012. So on 11th of September, 9/11, 2012. So first of all, of course, that's an anniversary worth noting. But so still, what happened then? That's when the U.S. ambassador that was killed, and there was big discussion afterwards why the security officer at the embassy did not warn him about not going out in the streets that day. So this is our total recordings of mentions of social unrest and protests in Libya on that day. As you can see, of course, there's a huge peak after things happened on 9/11. But if you go back and look at the days before this and bring up the scale, you can see that there was actually some interesting things happening there. So green here is general media talking, blue is tweets, and red is retweets. Retweets are quite interesting here because that's, again, the indication of how engaged people are in something. If there's a lot of retweets about a topic, it's clearly a sign that a lot of people are engaging in this. I think it's important to talk about. So as we can see here, in the weeks preceding this event, there was quite a bit of discussion about people being upset with the government and wanting to protest and so on. So, just looking at this picture, you could say that the security guy at the embassy maybe should have warned the ambassador of going out in an unarmed car that day. So what we wanted to do then was to see, can we generalize this? Can we actually build a model which can predict this kind of unhappiness? So we went back to our data. We looked at different places. We looked in Egypt. I think it's Lebanon on the down side here. Hope you can see on this screen. So what we have is here, let's on the upper left-hand side first. The green chart here is forward mentioning tweets. So these are things which are of, the kind, I'm pretty upset about something, I should go out and protest. And the red one is more big media reports about protests which have happened. And the interesting thing, of course, here is that you can see in most cases, there is a pretty sharp green peak, maybe a day or a few hours or a couple of days ahead of the actual thing happening. And the same thing in the lower right-hand here, the blue is forward-looking tweets saying about we should be doing things, and the red is reports about things that have happened. And as you can see in the middle here, around 10:15, there are definitely cases when there is no clear indication. This is the nature of forecasting. You won't be able to catch everything, but if you can catch at least some of those cases, it's still pretty good. So what we did here, this is applying this model. So we trained on data from 17 countries in the Middle East, and we think that for this case, for the physical attacks, you actually should do this in a fairly limited sort of spatial domain, because we think, culture is different, the way people talk about things and what they do and so on will differ. So I would not use a model trained on the Middle East to predict things in Europe, for example, because I think the behavior is culturally quite different. What one can see in this picture, so this picture, as you see, the x-axis here is the event date and the y-axis is the publication date. So the diagonal is really when people are talking about things which have just happened or is just about to happen. Not very interesting. The interesting thing on the left-hand side here is this red bar, which we can see that a month ahead of time, people were talking about protests on the last of June. And the reason for this was that this was the anniversary of Morsi coming into power as president. And people were saying very early on that we don't like this, we should be protesting. So the pattern there is actually the same you could probably detect in Europe, about the traditional May 1 protests, the sort of demonstrations and stuff. But of course, when you have a normal demonstration on 1st of May, people go out and they protest, and then 2nd of May, everyone is happy and goes back to work again. That's what, most of Western Europe tends to look like. And you might think, just looking at the talk here, that this would be the same thing here in Egypt. However, what the model predicted was, it said that, on the right-hand side here, it said that not only will there be problem there, it actually predicted that we think it will be bigger problems in the days coming after. Based on historical patterns and the amount of volume discussion we had and so forth, the model could actually predict here that we could do this. And in general, what we discovered was that this model, trained on these 17 countries and then applied, can actually predict, let's call it, unusually high levels of social unrest in individual cities with 85% precision a couple of days into the future. So coming back to the weather forecast analogy, this essentially means that, just like the weather forecast can tell you whether it's a good idea to bring an umbrella or not the next day, this forecast could tell you if you should put on an armored vest or something when you're going out next day. Which is, again, all these things won't happen, but it's better to be safe than sorry. So we were pretty encouraged when we did this, it showed that there was some predictive power in the data. But then, of course, we wanted to see, can we use this in the cyberspace as well? So our inspiration for the cyber protest detection actually comes from, you could say, Chicago police. So this is quite controversial. I won't go into how controversial it is, the fact that they're doing this. But the idea they have is that by taking historic data about shootings in Chicago, they think that they are able to predict where shootings will happen, not so hard maybe, but also who will be shot and who will be shooting. So predicting bad guys. And the idea really here is that also that the fact that which neighborhood you live in sort of decides a bit what career you will pursue in life. So if you, for example, live in a neighborhood where there are a lot of drug dealers, there's probably an increased risk that you will become a drug dealer yourself. Or someone else who lives in a neighborhood where people steal cars might be more likely to pursue a career in car stealing. So we think that there is something to this notion of, the neighborhood you're in decides something about how you might be acting in the future. So this is really our idea, can we find bad neighborhoods in the cyber world as well? And can we use them to predict something? So first of all, of course, we need to think about what a neighborhood is. And, this is my favorite XKCD Hilbert space map of the IPv4 address space. So let's focus on IPv4 here because people never talk about IPv6 for some reason. So the idea here is just like in the physical world, if you're an IP address and you live up in some specific point here, we thought that maybe if we look at the surroundings, the neighborhood here, maybe you can get some interesting prediction on how likely this other IP address, which we've never heard of before, is of behaving maliciously in some way. I think it's quite important to note here that this is one of the neighborhood models you can have. There are other ways which an IP can be close to someone else. Not only the CIDR address block you're in here, like here, but also things like which ASN do you belong to, who has registered stuff on your domain, on your IP address, and things like that. So there's which name server is associated with the domain which has this IP and so on. So there are multiple ways of defining neighborhood, but let's stick to the simple IP address block one. So before going ahead here, I'm a bit curious, how many of you in the room here have built any machine learning based system? 3, 4, 5, not too many. Good. So I'll bore you for 3 minutes by doing my 3-minute introduction to machine learning for everyone. The basic idea about machine learning is that you build classifiers. The only thing machine learning really does is classify things, right? And it's based on the idea that you have some features of some kind. Those features could be decided by a human, or if you're doing deep learning, you can actually have your algorithms find the relevant features. And then for each feature, you have some weight, which tells you how important this feature is. What you do is you take your vector of features, 1 if it's present and 0 if it's not. You multiply by the weight, you sum everything up, and then you check against the threshold. Is this sum above a certain threshold? In that case, you'll say that something belongs to that category. That's essentially what you do. So for an example, if we choose feathers, beak, and fur as our features, and I show something up on the right side here, a little bird, and I'll say that, okay, so this has feathers and a beak, and the system will say, okay, it's a bird. If I show it, this one with a beak and a fur, it's going to say it's a platypus. If I was lucky enough to provide that training data, which you might forget about when you're doing this. So classification is all we really do here. And in this case, I as a human provided these high-level features of feather, beak, and fur. However, if you do deep learning, then you add more layers, more neuron layers in your system, and you do some convolution, so you do some clever rotation of your features in here. And this will, as by magic, actually allow you to input just a bitmap, just an image on the left-hand side. And some intermediate layer here will actually become, by training, a feature detector. So, you could imagine that there will actually be some layer in between here which will actually be finding feather, fur, and beak based on, thousands or millions of training data examples. And of course, the beauty of this is that we don't have to code this. We just have to provide enough training data for the system to be able to learn and hopefully generalize what we do here. So what we want to do now is we want to do exactly this. The only difference is that instead of a picture of a bird, we want to put in an IP address, and we want to go classify it. Is it good or is it bad? That's our intention. So the data we used for this, we used two different sets of data. One part is we used traditional threat lists, the one which I'm sure many of you subscribe to and put into your system, just lists of bad known malicious IP addresses, which you can harvest from all kinds of places. So these are, of course, of high value. Sometimes they're a bit late, but they provide essentially no context at all. It might be that a certain list is just talking about IPs with a certain category, but in general, they're very context-free. And then we combine this information with our open source intelligence. So, all the data we have in our system where we've done our natural language processing, so we know in which context is a certain IP address being talked about. Is it mentioned as being the, say, source of a botnet attack or something like that? So this, and in what kind of what entities are talked about together with it. So you can say, to be very precise here, what we will be doing now, we will not be predicting malicious IPs per se. We will actually be predicting if IP addresses will be popping up on threat lists a couple of days into the future. But we're assuming that that's a pretty good approximation of being malicious, the fact that you show up on one of these threat lists. So the first approach we took was to just say that let's look at this neighborhood. Let's look at the malicious IP addresses and the unknown IP addresses and see how far off are they. So here's the interesting thing. This is the distribution, how far away in CIDR distance on the x-axis here are the new bad IPs from existing IPs. And as you can see, there are, it varies, but there's, most of it is not very far off. And then we look instead of take a number of random IPs and see how far off are they from the known bad guys, from new bad guys. And it turns out that the distribution is skewed quite significantly to the right. So this actually tells us, it should be possible, when you look at this naively, I should say, to actually use just the distance from known malicious IPs as a measure. Let's transform this a bit. Let's stack these two on each other. We'll see. So the red one are the bad IPs and the blue are the random ones. And it's the red one we want to predict. So looking at this, we want high precision. So we want to set a threshold in distance here, which would allow us with high precision to decide if a new IP address is malicious or not. So looks like we could set it somewhere around here, right? So let's say that not most, but if you go below 10, then a huge majority of the new IP addresses seem to be malicious, and very few are actually random IPs. So things look good, but this is actually an illusion in this case. And the reason for that is that, let me actually back up a second here. So if you look at let's see if this thing works. Doesn't work at all. Too bad. If you look at this small false positive, the small green ones here, right to the left, it looks like there are very few false positives here. But the problem is that we're looking at different scales here, and because if you look at all the IP addresses out there, it's only about 1 to 10 to the power of 5. So 1 of every 100,000 IP addresses is actually on a threat list. So this, small portion of the one here, which is actually a much larger number than the red one, the true positives in this case. So it turns out it's quite unbalanced. So this is actually not a good way to do this. You'll get way too many false positives if you just looked at the distance. So our conclusion was that just looking at distance is not enough. You really have to add more features. So the simple model we decided to go on with then was to say that we'll be looking at what we call a population of interest of IPs. We'll define that as this, so it's IP mentioned on X next to Y. So, we look at the source. Is it anywhere on the internet, or is it on a specific source like Twitter, Pastebin, some specific accounts we pick, virus total, a good example, and so on. And the other part is what else is being talked about at that place. So are people talking about anything in general, or are they talking about malware? Are they talking about, let's say, botnets, or about command and control centers and so on? So essentially, we're classifying all the neighbors not only by the distance, but also by what kind of thing they have. And then we want to look about this over different distances. So if you look at this IP address in the middle here, essentially the model we're building is that we're looking in concentric circles, different distances, up to 10. And we're checking, what are the properties of the known IPs in this space. If they're on a whitelist, very interesting, that's actually sort of probably a negative weight towards becoming malicious. But then we want to see, is it mentioned on Twitter? Is it mentioned on Twitter as the source of an attack? Or is it mentioned on Pastebin, in connection with malware, and so on. And then we add a third dimension where we're actually looking back in time. So we're seeing how long ago was it something was mentioned? Is it 1, 2, or 3 weeks back in time where someone mentioned about this? Because the challenge is, of course, that everything is continuously changing. So when we do this, we get a total of something like 15,000 different features, which we calculate for every one of the 4 billion IPv4 addresses we have out there. Pretty big address, pretty big space. So we actually decided, for practical reasons, when we actually built this system, to divide the problem in 2 different parts. So one part is actually deciding, out of these 15,000 different features, what are the most significant ones, the one which we should focus on. And we trained on that first. That allowed us actually to cut it down to much smaller space, only, I think, 200 to 300 features typically, which are the most important ones. So for doing our daily training, which is the second phase here, where we look at all the existing known places, or known IPs, then we only look at about 200 to 300 features for each of those. And that's what we build. And this is then what allows us to do. So the feature map is something we can calculate maybe every month or every quarter. Whereas this actual predictive model, which looks at the current state of everything we know about IP addresses, combined with these 200 features, that's something we recalculate every day, because that's really has to be up-to-date information exactly about what's malicious right now in order to have a chance to predict what's going to be malicious next day. So, how good is this then? Well, first of all, one should say that threat lists in themselves are pretty predictive. Just like the best way to predict the weather is still to say that it's going to be the same weather tomorrow as it is today. I think that still holds, unless there's a meteorologist in the room who has a different opinion. So that's a first good indication. So 45% are actually repeats. The next days are the same. We added some little clever way. We have what we call our extended threat lists, where we actually could bump that up to 66%. So in our extended threat lists, which are not done using machine learning, but by just looking at the context things are talked with, we could up that a bit. But then what the machine learning part allowed us is to add another 9 or 10% to this. So combining all this, we actually can predict 75% of the malicious IPs, or the IPs which occur on the next week threat list, which is not so bad. It's a sort of incremental improvement, and I think there's still tons of more stuff to do here. The big challenge is really then, if you can have that kind of recall, what precision do you get? And as I said, the big challenge here is that it's a very unbalanced test set. So one way you could say that if you balance the test set, which I would say is machine learning's people's way of cheating and actually doing, trying to look better than they are. In this case, what we actually did, which was more interesting, was that we discovered that the system was not really good at predicting individual IP addresses. And the reason is that, as you can see, we did a lot of prediction based on different distances. So what we found was that what we actually were or are quite good at is predicting at a CIDR 24 block level, so ignoring the least significant 8 bits of the address. So at that block level, we can actually have a precision of something around 70% or so. So a fair amount of false positives still, but definitely to the point today where people who are using this say that it's at least a good indication that if I'm a very paranoid person or organization, I will block these automatically. If not, maybe I'll just, if I have time, I'll go in and manually investigate if this is an address which I should be concerned about when it pops up in my system. So I think we're actually come to a point here for IPs where we're getting closer to, well, reasonably close to the sort of weather forecast thing, that we're close enough we can tell people if they should bring an umbrella tomorrow or not. So definitely a first step. Just to give you one example, here's an individual IP address, and we see its risk score between 0 and 1 over time. 0.75 here is the threshold we choose when to say that something is unusual, as we like to call it, euphemistically, so probably bad. And in this case, you can see it actually popped above this threshold level 10 days before it was mentioned as being strongly associated with dark comet. So a good example of, if you use this list, you could actually block things in your system 10 days before it actually turned out to be something bad. And of course, interesting to see that the trick here is to be, 1 or 2 days earlier, because of course what happens is that we detect that here, and then it gets mentioned, and then, with the multiplicative effect of the internet, once someone mentions something, everyone copies everyone else. So then, there's tons of information out there. But it's only by using this kind of model where you can actually be ahead of time. So one might ask, why does this work? It seems a little bit like magic. And I think our understanding is really this, that the underlying reason this works is that if you're a threat actor, whether you're the NSA or Korean hackers, government hackers, or anonymous, everyone who wants to be a successful threat actor needs to be a bit rational. So you need to organize your IT support, your IT operations, which means that these guys also, build their infrastructure in an organized way. They hire space in data centers, they allocate IP blocks, and so on. So the more rational, the more organized they become in their behavior, which they need to do to be efficient, the more predictable they actually become. So we will this kind of system will never predict everything. It's just like with terrorism, you can never really predict the single lunatic who's going to do something bad. But it's much more easy in some ways to detect the guys who are doing more, let's say, more organized crime. And the same thing here, as people get more organized, they become more rational, and they actually become more predictive. So we think there's a fair chance here that we can do, at least help guys on the preventive side to be more aware of what's happening. So what's next then? Well, we like this model. We're taking it to other domains now. So the first one is, of course, to not only do this on IP addresses, but actually do it on domains as well, which is a somewhat trickier problem. The reason is, of course, that for domains, we don't have a finite address space. There are more than 4 billion domains, of course. So this proximity measure is not immediately obvious as such. But we think it's actually doable. We think we can do some interesting stuff there. We're also looking at predicting exploits or vulnerabilities. Very similar, we have exploit.db in other places as the track record of what has been exploited. So probably we can predict things there as well. And one of my favorites right now, excuse me, is looking at phishing attacks. So we have some different indicators there. One indicator is, of course, the registration of typo-squatting domains, very strong indicator. Another interesting indicator we think is actually disasters. So phishing guys like to use disasters as the bait. If you get a text message saying, well, first you get a news flash saying that there's been a train accident in the place where you live. And then you get a message saying, we think your sister might have been involved in this accident. You're extremely likely to click on that, especially if you have a sister. So we think that looking at big disasters and the amount of media coverage they're getting, which is exactly what we record in our system, is a way to at least find candidates. And then, of course, you combine these two. If you have a domain which has been registered for typo squatting, and then you combine it with the information about some accident with a lot of attention, clearly you could at least warn people that there might be something happening. And, the list goes on. I think in general, the interesting thing here is that by having both long historical track record and huge amounts of data in general, we're actually starting to be able to have a little bit of foresight into what's coming down the line, which I think is a big difference from the way most of security is done today, which is just, looking in the back mirror and fixing things which have already happened. So that was what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you. I don't know. Do we have time for questions, or if there are questions, or do we do that online or offline?
We have 10 minutes. We have 10 to 5 minutes for questions, so...
So Rodrigo Garcia, Nexthink. My question is related to what you just said about all the applications. So do you think this call for help for medical reasons or for children or something, so making use of the feelings of the people, it's something to consider for your application?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I think the bad guys are very good at touching the right pieces of us in that sense, clearly. And I think, what I'm most concerned about, if you look into the future, is now I'm talking about, how we on the good side, presumably here, how we can use these techniques. But of course, the bad guys will use exactly the same techniques. So far they haven't, mostly because they make enough money as it is, I think. But, I think they will be using NLP, for example, to improve the quality of the text they're doing. My favorite fear of the future is actually, if someone starts actually analyzing, the communications you have with your friends, not only will they be able to send things which look like they come from a friend of yours, but they will be able to mimic the style in which he writes to you. So I think, both that, and then, they should be able to use machine learning also to figure out which are the most, which strings should you be touching in the hearts of people to make them more likely to open a thing or click on a link or something like that.
Thank you.
Have a guy in the back there. Oh.
Hello, very
Hello.
nice presentation. Thank you very much. My question is if you are and how you're dealing with poisoning in your data. So, for example, if I'm a hacker and I know, this system exists. Many companies are actually scanning everything you say. I would change the way I write. So, for example, I would put random words in my text in order to avoid being detected. Are you dealing with poisoning and noise?
So those are two different things, right? So poisoning is very tricky, because we're building the system on what people talk about. So the one way you can handle that in some cases is by requiring multiple sources to be talking about something before you take it into account. So we actually do that in some cases, but there's still a risk. This is a big problem. It's you can deal with it. You can stop some of the effects of it by having whitelists, for example. But again, poisoning is a challenge. And it's also, if you look at let's not look at this IP world, but look at in general, the problem is that as a threat analyst, you actually need to know about fake news as well. Since, it's fake news about your company could be as important as real news about it, right? So I think the only way you have to do is you have to be able to have mechanisms for trying to detect whatever. And then, I think it still has to be a human in there in the loop somewhere trying to do things. So I think that maybe answers the noise question as well. I think, that you have the only way to deal with it is we do some classification of trusted sources, for example. So for one example, if you look at, let's say, for example, the judgment of if an IP is malicious. So if the source there is let's say a trusted blogger or something like that, it could be enough with one reference to something for us to trust it. Whether if it's just an unknown Twitter account, will require multiple mentions before we actually take it into account.
Mostly for the dark web sources that you have, where people there are really
they
how
love to do that, right? Yeah.
how to go away. So
yeah. So for example, in this, so for dark web, we actually treat that data in different ways. We would not include that in something like this, because it's as you said, it's not trustworthy. So I would say dark web data is in our system more relevant, for detecting when people are, selling credentials to your company or something like that. And in that case, I think you must always alert on it because it could be true. But then the only way to really do that is to have a human analyst go in and look at it and try to judge how credible it is or not.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. I came in a little bit late, so you may have answered this question, but do you have other people that you would point to who are doing similar work? And do you have any comments on how good their work is?
There is some related work done by Verizon way back on this. They looked more at threat lists in isolation, and they looked at how duplicative they were and so on. I actually haven't seen anyone who's been doing this kind of predictive analytics. So if you have a pointer to anyone here, I'd be very happy to hear about that. It's always good to learn from others, but not in this particular domain. No. Okay, maybe it's time for coffee. Thanks again.